Hello everyone, welcome to this session on navigating the journeys of peatland projects through time and various policy frameworks. Thank you all for coming and listening to us. We have a couple of live presentations today and some recorded presentations followed by a Q&A. I will be moderating the questions as they come through. So I am in the invidious position of being quite a gatekeeper in that I can direct them to who I think best fit, but also back to you guys to get a perspective on what questions you'd really like to have answered. So please pay close attention to everyone, and we look forward to the discussion and the presentation. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone and welcome. So my name is Mark Reed. I am recently appointed as the Director of Rural Entrepreneurship at Scotland's Rural College. I am also going to be, the Director of a new centre. It's under development, so for those of you who are interested, this is the Thriving Natural Capital Challenge Centre. And of course, given my interests in peatlands, this will of course have a major component to do with peatlands. I am also research lead for the IUCN UK Peatland programme and was involved in the original setup of the Peatland Code and am on its executive board. And I'm going to present to you today some research that I'm doing with colleagues on two projects funded by BBSRC and the Global Food Security Programme and by NERC in its ICASP project. Essentially, what we're trying to address with ecosystem markets is a major funding gap. So RSPB published a report recently suggesting that there was a £1.8 billion gap that we needed to fill if we were going to meet our biodiversity targets under international law. And two different estimates, a Committee on Climate Change estimate and a higher UK Treasury estimate that ultimately suggests a £1 trillion gap to get to net zero by 2050. And of course, all of this in the context of what we know are going to be reductions in post-Brexit funding for agri-environment and a post-COVID recession. So the opportunity is twofold, I think. First of all, there is a large UK investor market and of course a much larger international investor market. And although it's small, there is a growing impact investment community as part of this, willing to accept significantly lower than market rate returns on their investments and willing to accept a bit more in the way of risk. At the same time, the existing ecosystem markets in the UK, including the Peatland Code, are seeing a rapid grow in demand from investors. And there is a proliferation of new ecosystem markets to meet this demand. Now, we've done a comparative analysis, and I'll give you a link to the draft paper. It's so hot off the press, I was still writing it this morning. In an attempt to finish writing the paper before presenting it, always a good idea. And we've got four European peatland schemes that we're looking at. The Peatland Code, of course, one of those. And then a range of UK schemes which are either in operation or close to market. And you can see a wide range of different types of scheme. The Blue Impact Fund is in fact an aquaculture scheme. Ultimately, what we've done is we've classified these into a typology, three broad types of ecosystem market that exist. And I think it's useful to understand the landscape in which things like the Peatland Code that we've been thinking about already today might fit into. And it fits into the category of a national carbon market. So strong on verification, validation, additionality. These in many cases are fungible. Climate mitigation benefits, in some cases marketed as offsets. And in terms of the scope of the market, these are typically national markets selling to national buyers within that country. And that means that in many cases that can count towards that country's net zero targets. There's usually a lot of government funding, as we saw from the Welsh example there, significant amounts of the funding coming from government sources or other sources, I think life in that case as well. Secondly, then we've got these regional ecosystem markets, and in the paper we've thought about this in some depth because they seem to break a lot of the rules of what you would expect to work, either in terms of national carbon markets or green finance. For a national carbon market, as with any payment for ecosystem market, you would expect that the money that you put in will deliver provable, evidenceable benefits, and that falls down. So yes, people are paying for things and they hope to get something, but there's very little in the way of validation. So why are people investing millions in these? That seems a bit strange. Equally, the people who are investing do not have any guaranteed return. In fact, there's no guarantee that they even get their money back. That's not how these are working. And essentially what is going on here is that these are risk-based markets. So the intermediaries are working business to business. These are businesses who have risk registers with climate change and other environmental risks on there. They know how exposed they are. They know how expensive that could be to them. And now, in contrast to the expense that they might be exposed to, the interventions that are proposed in the landscape now look like good value for money. And when you compare the kind of validation that you're able to do in these markets to the kind of validation you typically have on initiatives to reduce risk, then it seems to stack up, well, at least in terms of the investors who are investing so far. Now, I do wonder if there's going to be a bit of a ceiling to this, and this is one reason why landscape enterprise networks, which is one example of this, which we're studying, is looking now to integrate national carbon markets and habitat banking, which is an example of green finance, the third of these three categories. Green bonds, although we've not got these in our sample, there are insurance products as well, and loan-based products that would fit into this. And as I say, this is all about return on investment, but accepting a bit more risk and lower return. Now, the challenge, well, there are two main challenges. So the first is that there are supply side issues. We talked about some of the issues in terms of the land owning and land managing community earlier in the day. A lot of barriers, whether that's just uncertainty over future schemes or the complexity or longevity of contracts and such like, or just an area of land, finding enough room for woodland creation, which is of course a national project given the targets, national challenge given the targets that we have. There's also a challenge that at the moment we only have the woodland code, woodland carbon code and the peatland code, and there are many other kinds of code that are ideally needed to provide investors with the confidence they need that if they invest that they will get what they expect out of that. So two that are being explored at the moment are a salt marsh code, and I'm coordinating a group that is exploring the feasibility of a UK farm soil carbon code. That wouldn't include peatland, lowland peatland projects. As Renee said, that's going to be coming in to version 2 of the peatland code. And to do that, there's a number of things. A few examples of those things that we need to understand are whether there are actually interventions that will deliver benefits and monetizable benefits at that. We need to be able to actually validate them in a cost-effective way because it's a market mechanism. And we need intermediaries and brokers who can aggregate not only the demands, so get investors in and create liquidity in that way, but also to get that pipeline of projects ready for investors to put their money into. And the final challenge is that we need to think, I think, a lot more carefully about how we might integrate the private schemes. So, for example, we're getting significant amounts of money going into these regional ecosystem markets, but those are typically regional investors investing locally. Can we now break those local links and now move to national or international investors in that to increase the amount of money available? And can we increase the range of services available by integrating woodland carbon projects with peatland projects upstream, with perhaps dairy or arable projects in the lowlands? And at the same time, we also need to think about the challenge of blending this with public finance. Now, I'll give you the paper so you'll have much more detail on this, but we've got three options in the paper for how we might integrate private schemes. This first option looks at how an intermediary or broker can act as a demand aggregator or a demand supplier, and then can broker a package of benefits arranged by different investors to put into different projects that could cover different ecosystem services, habitats, and such like. The second version of this puts that aggregator primarily in this position here of coordinating the projects, and then they then separately go and find the finance. Or it can operate in an integrated whole. Although the issue here is potentially there is a conflict of interests where you are both supplying the projects and getting the investment and the funding for them. And so in terms of price setting, that throws up a few issues. Much more in the paper. I want to finish with some thoughts on how we can blend public and private finance. The challenge here is that if we don't get this right, then public funding for ecosystem services through post-Brexit agricultural schemes could potentially decrease demand for and outcompete private funded schemes. And that, of course, would be an unfortunate outcome if the market was, in fact, able to supply those benefits. So we've come up with 5 different options, much more in the paper that I'll give you access to. And we've been working with government colleagues in particular on this idea of trigger funds. The idea that, yeah, we will give you a certain amount of government funding, but that then has to trigger a certain amount of private funding for you to get the rest of that public funding. And so you are leveraging private funding with your the design of your public scheme. In conclusion, if we can get this right, and that is, of course, a very big if, many challenges ahead, then we have private ecosystem markets with robust standards operating at scale. And we're talking investment scale here that can be channeling billions rather than millions, in theory, across multiple land uses and habitats. We've got integration between these private schemes at landscape scale so that we're preventing ecosystem service trade-offs. So we've not got one scheme which is actually now having externalities for another scheme. And finally, public funding that is now able to help develop and manage new standards, a major role there, much work to be done, and help get projects ready for investment. So, for example, the Environment Agency's new Investment Readiness Fund, and in Scottish Government, I forgot the name of it now, but a fund under development there for something similar. And finally, the idea that once we have this operational, increasingly, as we see public funding gradually decreasing, as I would anticipate, both due to the economic outlook and what we know is going to happen post-Brexit in terms of agri-environment schemes, we see the private investment increasing and increasingly not only filling the gap left by the public purse, but the gap that we see between what we have now and what is needed to address the climate and extinction emergencies. And at the end of the day, we then are prioritizing public funding for projects that would not be delivered by the market. So I'm going to conclude and thank you for your time and take questions at the end and hand over to the next speaker.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this session. My name is Liz Lewis-Reddy. I work for the Policy and Economics Business Unit in ADAS, and today I'll be talking to you about a landscape scale project called the Peatland Project, which is a wildlife trust-led initiative based in the heart of Wales. Before I crack on with the specific details of the Peatland Project, I thought it would be useful for you to have an insight as to precisely why we thought it would be useful to have a session on the changing landscape and how projects have evolved to fit that landscape over time in this particular conference, given the shifting sands of the regulatory, legislative, and political framework that we're currently in. So all of the projects you will hear from this morning are long in the tooth and have been underway for at least one RDP period and throughout the course potentially of the Peatland Code development. So it will give a really interesting opportunity to reflect back on the lessons we've learned in how to adapt and respond to the challenges and opportunities that have emerged over that time period, and use those going forward, both for our own projects, your projects, and potentially the consortia as a whole. But to go back to the Pemlimin project specifically, as I said, it's quite a long-term project. It's been rolling over the majority of 3 RDP periods. It had its initial genesis back in 2007 with its first round of funding in 2008. And then it has subsequently gone on to secure a range of different funding sources and is continuing on into the future, with the current funding from the Welsh Government's RDP scheme looking specifically at the Payment for Ecosystem Services agenda. To give you an understanding of where the project is, and I won't belabor these slides because, as I said, since we've been around so long, we've presented at a few Peatland conferences, but essentially it's a 40,000 hectare chunk of mid-Wales, which encompasses a range of different types of habitats, both blanket bogs, agricultural habitats, softwood plantations, hardwood plantations. So there's a range of opportunities and ecosystems with which to work. But the reason why the Wildlife Trust initially got involved in this area in particular is not only because there is a nature reserve and a triple SI within that 40,000 hectares, but there is a general decline in biodiversity, which we're all now well aware of. And when investigations were made into why this was happening, it became quite apparent that it wasn't solely the biodiversity that was declining, but there was an actual decline in the socioeconomics of the area as well. So we had situations where the farming community is aging and not being replaced by successive generations, which is resulting in a less managed landscape and therefore one of lower value biodiversity in certain areas and an over-intensive active agriculture in others. So it was the usual diaspora of situations in the rural countryside where you have a big chunk of landscape and people are only actively involved in a small part of it. As a result of all these investigations, and given the links between those different communities, ecological, economic, and social, the Wildlife Trust hit upon the idea of effectively creating a scenario where those communities were embedded in the outcomes and outputs of a high-quality natural environment. So it was no longer just solely focused on farming or tourism, but it was instead an understanding of the additional products and opportunities that could be generated if the environment within which they lived was healthy and thriving. So at the time when this was put together, 5-year plan being from 2008 to 2013, we termed these environmental goods and services like clean water, carbon safeguard, as we termed it then, and managing the flood water which is flowing off the hills, with the idea that we'd be able to take these to market to enable those communities to derive a living from, as I said, the outputs from a high quality environment, as opposed to just purely food production. In order to develop this argument, however, there were a number of things that we needed to overcome. Firstly, we needed to develop a relationship with the landowning community because, as I said, even though the Wildlife Trust did own a small chunk of the 40,000 hectares, the majority of it was under private ownership. In Wales, the landscape is slightly different from elsewhere in the UK, whereas that there's a number of small fragmented holdings rather than tending to be large estates on these peat masses. So in order to prove or practice what we preached, we had to find opportunities with friendly contacts in the landowning communities to develop those relationships, demonstrate that we could understand how to affect land management change and land use change, and then find a way to quantify it, which would then enable us to be able to measure a product that could then be taken to a market, whatever that market was. So our initial ambitions were always very much focused on supply. And in 2008, we did just that with the Environment Agency funding to which I referred earlier. We found a small 2-hectare site. We identified that it was heavily drained. We then did an NVC phase 2 classification, assessment of it, so we could understand how the ecological asset was changing as a result of our land management interventions, and it ends up looking like this. So right away, we were able to demonstrate relationships with the landowning community, develop our evidence base to show that what we wanted to do was achievable and crucially measurable. So from that next learning point, we then had to find a way to quantify the output from these environmental land management interventions that we could then say were scientifically evidenced or robust enough to have assurance from the market. Because at this time, we were still very much focused on the supply of the asset and managing that relationship with the people who'd be generating the supply in the future. So our next step was then to implement a scientific monitoring process that looked at water movement rather than just ecological communities, to give us another string to the bow of what actually was changing as a result of the works we were doing on the ground. We then also looked at the ongoing sustainable land management associated with these areas once we restored the hydrological processes that underpinned it, and grew a greater awareness of the community of what exactly were the gaps in the system, and the relationships that we had with the landowning communities began to build and build. And of course then, as with all of our projects, as I'm sure you will hear later and earlier in this conference, we then started developing relationships with the people at the sticky end of the system, those who affect policy change, the ones who help to facilitate demand and develop the tools necessary for business to participate in these systems. And crucially, during all this time, we were gathering economic data. So we weren't just focusing on the ecological impacts that we were having, but we were trying to translate that change into pounds and pence, so that as we grew to understand the market, we could have those discussions both with the selling community and the buying community as to exactly what the opportunities were for this area. That was up until the end of the RDP, which ended in around 2013. And as I said, because we'd had those conversations with the policymakers as well as the landowning community, we began to see some of the evidence that we had been generating as influencing the new policies going forward. And whereas we had, to a certain extent in our minds, pioneered the perspective of a resilient social community embedded within a resilient ecological system, the Welsh government in particular took that opportunity on board and developed things. I wouldn't say this is entirely due to us, but we did help facilitate things like the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which then moved on to the wider understanding of the sustainable management of natural resources. And as you can see on the slide, there was a range of target areas that fit quite nicely with the 5-year plan that we had originally trialed and suggested in 2008. So that placed us perfectly for this current round of the RDP, where we were able to demonstrate that we know what exactly it is we have as an opportunity in the Welsh uplands, and that we have developed the evidence base to enable us to take this opportunity to market. But the one big gap that we had in our armory was an understanding of what the demand was. So given that a significant range of tools had been developed, science had moved on, we took this opportunity to reflect back on our understanding of the natural asset in the area and bring that up to date so that we fully were able to market and discuss with the business community what there was to sell from the area. So we undertook an upgrade in terms of our understanding of the carbon opportunities, in terms of the cleanliness of water opportunities, in terms of the managing the flood risk opportunities, and a range of other services as well, in order for us to have a proper tangible understanding to then discuss with the wider system. And then crucially, we took another step change at this point. We recognized that there was a range of actors in the system. When we started out, it was just the wildlife trusts and the local landowners. But as the project evolved and as time moved on, other intermediaries began to get into the system, those who could help bring that product to market. Things like, for example, the Peatland Code, a mechanism by which the business community could get directly involved with carbon sequestration projects through an accredited system which was underpinned by government support because of their investment in the Peatland Commission. So that really was a step change for us. That alongside the Woodland Code, which had obviously been running throughout the project area. And we had seen that these emerging tools really required us to understand how they fit in the system, how we fit in the system, and what the potential gaps were for some of these other environmental goods and services or ecosystem services that we'd identified as quite fundamental and an opportunity to the area. And as you can see from this slide, there were 8 that we chose in the end as being the ones that we would focus on because of their opportunity or their understanding as a short-term gain, or at least understand where they were in terms of the supply chain development. We then went on to create a relatively simplistic understanding of precisely how that individual environmental product sat within an existing or non-existent supply chain. So were there already a consortium of sellers ready to offer a joint product to market? And did they have the appropriate intermediaries to provide the assurance, the accreditation, the monitoring protocol, the branding to then approach the demand end of the spectrum? Or was there just, well, we've got a big chunk of land, we know that it does things like sequester carbon and cleans water, but nobody's actually interested in buying it because the science isn't there, or we don't have a trusted intermediary, or there isn't a regulatory lever that will facilitate their involvement in the system. So that was the next process that we took to assess those particular environmental products or ecosystem services from the project area. And this was all underpinned by that changing legislative framework of understanding that it's about the resilient and sustainable management of natural resources, building in that economy, ecology, and community. And at the same time, as we had in the initial iterations of the project, we were looking at the gross margins, the pounds and pence figures associated with some of these particular services. So it was very fundamental to us that we never let go of the 3 legs of the stool, and we're always looking to try and achieve that sustainable ambition. We then went on from that analysis to generate effectively a traffic light system of market readiness in terms of allowing us to take forward an opportunity in the area. And as you can see, woodland carbon scored quite highly. And interestingly also, because price was a consideration within this system, community natural spaces scored higher than peatland carbon. So that reflected an opportunity that we weren't expecting, but of course was essentially a relic of the area that we were in, that there was quite an active social community in that region. So the next step then was very much to take this knowledge, this understanding of our asset, this robust underpinning evidence to the market and find out, is there actually someone interested in acquiring these opportunities, or is this just a matter of us understanding our assets so that if there's an emergent supply chain, we'll be able to participate, but at the moment we have to hold fire. And we're in that process of understanding that relationship and developing contractual arrangements with people as it stands. So it's very much an emerging field for us to have moved from an primarily environmentally focused project, very much understanding the need for sustainability within the system, to one where we actually are having direct communications with the market. And that's not just a reflection of the changing legislative framework, but also a reflection of the community engagement, both at a local level within the project, but as a wider national and global community, as we're putting more pressure on the brands that we work with to get more actively involved in climate change, etc. So the context within which we're operating as a project has changed fundamentally from when we started. And that has been a real key learning point for us, along with the fact that we have invested so much in understanding the supply, our asset, the evidence base we need to compile in order to support it, but also the wider supply chain so that we can identify gaps and opportunities for the future. And that's precisely what we've demonstrated through this slide, is that we know that some of the supply chains don't have tools like the Peatland Code to work with, so there's a degree of gap in the accreditation and assurance. Who does what in the system is often quite challenging, and the reputation of all actors is quite fundamental at the early stages of a supply chain. And for those where there is a regulatory vehicle, it often preempts the system, but it can be limiting in ways as well. So we're still learning as we're going, but it's really fascinating for us to have started in one place and then to be where we are now. And then crucially, as the point of this conference will highlight, collaboration is something that is fundamental to the success of these systems. So we have always had knowledge transfer and exchange as key to going forward, with the idea that as PES systems develop, it's important to not have a race to the bottom. It's important for there to be standards and a baseline to be set so that we all understand the systems that we're working on and the principles of the systems that we're working within, and can have confidence as well. And crucially, for there to be some agreement around value, because we appreciate that a capitalist system might not be the best match for what it is that we want to achieve. So we have to reach some kind of consensus about the context and ethics within which we live, and how to protect this learning as we go forward, so that there can't be situations where we're undermined by other systems which then don't help us meet our potentially rather lofty ambitions of the sustainability agenda. So as we are still learning, and we have much more to learn, and we are very happy to share what we learn and what that means for ourselves and others going forward. But we have come a long way, and we're very happy to be where we are, and we're very exciting to see what the next steps are. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing any questions in the question and answer period.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to my shed in Huddersfield. I'm Christopher Dean, Head of Programme Delivery with the Most of the Future Partnership. Finance fund, massive thing for us over the past 17 years. We've been successful in raising 40 million for the work that we do in the peatland environment of the South Pennines, Dyke Peak, West Pennine Moors, but it's not been an easy piece of work, really pulling that money in, not been an easy piece of work dealing with that. So just some reflections from me on that, really. There's some irony that you have sat before you as one of the leaders of this debate on finance, someone who failed his CSE maths and sees Excel spreadsheets as a product of Beelzebub, really. But this is sort of the point that I'd like to make, really. We wouldn't expect a hedge fund manager to produce a PA2 survey for a countryside stewardship scheme, but we do expect our conservation staff to design very complicated financial mechanisms to work around VAT, full cost recovery models, carbon calculators, exchange rate planning, and even hedge fund managing. And I would ask whether we should expect ourselves to extend any further into this as we move into a complicated world of natural capital finance and offsetting. We need a serious approach to sorting this out in the way that we deal with that in a brokerage system, really. The Most of the Future Partnership has its legal entity within the Peak District National Park Authority. The authority is the accountable body for the financial, employment, contractual work of the partnership undertakes. And that financial facilitation which the authority has extended to the partnership via DEFRA has been really fundamental in us being able to work at all, really, and being able to operate. It does pose a question as to why similar authorities are not doing more to offer similar facilitation in this particular field. Cash flow in this area is often the biggest challenge, and I don't need to tell anybody on the line that at all, I'm sure, really. A number of organisations, public and private, could do more to help by stepping in to do the very good job that the Peak District National Park Authority does for the Most of the Future Partnership. Bradford Metropolitan District Council does for Pennine Prospects, and Durham County Council does for the North Pennines AONB partnership. Our local authority, National Park Authority, government agencies, landscapes, they're all public bodies. And we could work out better systems of ways of approaching that cash flow through those organisations. I've witnessed through this time countless occasions where a funder has really wanted to work with us, but the existing criteria of a fund has misinterpreted how things need to be delivered in order to meet the outcomes of that particular fund. And I think we need to be better at helping funders design their schemes so that they deliver the desired outcomes and they don't unwittingly create rather impossible hurdles for us to jump over in meeting grant bid criteria. There is an opportunity for us to consult with them. They do usually consult when drawing up bids, and it's a similar point to the point I made yesterday about getting involved in consultation with policy bodies. We really need to make sure that we are giving correct advice to National Lottery Heritage Fund and others when these are being set up, really. It's remained very difficult to pay people costs. It's seen by funders frequently as an unnecessary on cost, while all of those funders are paying their own staff without any consideration to those sort of sustained values. So I'm sure it's a frustration to all of us that it's difficult to find cost to pay people. I don't know how we're expected to do work if we don't pay for people, really. So the partnership has raised over 18 years, 40 million. But if we'd gone to any of our funders in 2002 and said we need an 18-year-long budget, all of them would have said that's impossible. But they've all then gone on to prove themselves wrong by making it possible and contributing to that £40 million budget over 18 years. So long-term finance is a challenge, and we need to pay attention to that, really. Our smaller project accounts over short-term periods, we've managed to stitch together into a longer programme. And again, it'd be good to get funders to better understand how they fit into a long trajectory and make them more comfortable with that. Funders frequently want to know their funds have achieved an endpoint and will not put further funds into something they consider to be already paid for or delivered. And we've been caught out before, particularly with between our two life projects. Thing we did in our first life project, we couldn't then finish off in the second life project because it was considered to have been finished. Short landing strip economics is something that our attention was brought to. For a short time, we had a business development manager working for us. He was ex-CFO of one of Sheffield's cutlery producers, and his last job was selling the business to a Chinese company. He was really surprised when he came to work for us at what he referred to as our dangerously short runway to land our projects on. And he thought that a private business would find this unacceptable. But really, we all do that. They're the landing strips we have, really. The likelihood of profit being at risk is a thing that a private company would be agonised over. And this is a bearing on our hopes for natural capital as well. We'll almost certainly end up working through brokers, considering the complexity of this area. A broker would not put up with risky short landing strips, and so is likely to want high fees to offset that risk, really. Leaving us again cutting our costs to the bone in order to make a project deliverable amidst the high fees brokering and those deals may ask for. We need to consider very carefully what we do about creating special purpose vehicles to carry out an ethical way of doing that brokerage for us on a not-for-profit basis, if we're going to take that forward and not be taken to the cleaners, really. The opportunity presented by natural capital has been around for some time. We produced an offsetting offer leaflet to the surrounding airports in 2004, and we've been approached in 2008 by the likes of the Chicago Climate Exchange wanting to create offset markets. Various initiatives have come and gone since, but it's now a much more serious option. Speaking to Tim Tom of the Yorkshire Peat Partnership earlier this week, he's now getting two to three offsetting requests from companies a week. We're also getting an increased number of interests, and we need to be ready for this, really. We have the Peatland Code, which is really useful, but the financial tsunami coming at us at present is overwhelming, and we're in danger of being dictated by natural capital brokers who are going to need those big fees, really. And we need to be careful before we get into bed with these people, and need to think about that quite carefully, really. We're in a big business world now. Peatlands mentioned in the Paris Agreement. Chancellor's last budget set aside 640 million for trees and peat. As Mark has already mentioned in his presentation, the people who want to plant trees are going to have difficulty finding land to do that, whereas we already have land set aside for peat. It already is serving that purpose. What we want to do is just make it more efficient and get good ecological condition back. So that pendulum within that 640 million split may end up swinging in our direction. I'd like to leave you with some thoughts of a very large financial figure. Mark Carney, ex-governor of the Bank of England, is presently giving the Reith lectures on Radio 4, and this is your homework from this session, really. Go and listen to the Reith lectures that Mark Carney is doing at the moment. Really good insight in where we're going and what we need to do, really. One of them is on climate finance. Here's the important bit, really, from that. What's the next career move of one of the world's leading bankers when he leaves the Bank of England? His next career move has been to go to become the UN Secretary General Special Envoy for Climate Finance. That's where this is going. You know, a leading world banker sees that his next career move is to get into climate finance. This is big business that we're getting into now, and we need to be ready for it, really. He makes some unexpected points for a banker. Why is water, which is fundamental to life, largely free, while diamonds with no fundamental value to life are so expensive? Why is Amazon listed as such a massively successful company all over the globe, while the Amazon appears on nobody's balance sheets? Neither does Fleet Moss, the Exmoor Myers, Chat Moss, or Bleaklow, for that matter. And he makes some good points about subjective values, which we all have to toe the line of if we wish to get involved in creating finance. We can sell ice cream when it's hot. We can talk about flooding when we have a flood, and we can talk about wildfires when Marsden Moor's on fire, but it's difficult to gain traction and funding when the drivers recede, when the fire's out, basically. Good points about people forming their norms as well. People tend to form their norms around wishing to be well thought of, and being well thought of is valuable to businesses which are selling us stuff, especially banks, banking, insurance, and the present flush of interest in working with is all about that image. So Mark made some good points about validation, and we are all agonized about validation, but we may not need to be as specific as we think, really, about what we're delivering, because it may be more to do with the public perceptions of that and around image. So we may not need to agonize about that as much as we think we might do, really. I'm going to leave it there. I'm interested to hearing what the questions and the debates are coming forward, because I've got very little in the way of answers, and I'm looking forward to some of the questions and comments that are coming from the rest of you. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name's Robert Duff. I'm a project manager for the Marches Mosses Bog Life project, and I'm going to talk about the journey that the Meres and Mosses Landscape Partnership has taken over the last 15 or so years as an example of a sort of lowland wetland example. I've worked on and off in the Meres and Mosses for 20 years, so I've sort of had an overview over that time. And so what I'm going to do is give you a quick introduction to the Meres and Mosses area, and then move on to go through the landscape partnership sort of milestones, and finish off with some thoughts about the future direction. So for anyone not familiar with the Meres and Mosses, here's a quick pen picture. They're an internationally significant wetland series, one of the most important in England. And for example, they contain the largest and most important grouping of natural lakes in lowland England. Also occurring is the third largest lowland raised bog in Britain, and rare examples of transition mire habitat and significant areas of basin fen and other types of wetland. And it's this wide variety and diversity which is one of the key features. All told, there are more than 200 different natural sites, wetland sites occurring across the Cheshire Plain and the North Shropshire area, and also part of the area extends into West Staffordshire. It's quite a large area, all told over 400,000 hectares. And of that, about 13,000 hectares consist of peat soils. And in many instances, there's quite deep peat deposits remaining. The sites, many of the sites are naturally dispersed and relatively isolated. And often this is exacerbated by occurring within a sort of lowland, rural farmland environment, and which is often heavily, where there's a heavy amount of drainage. A high proportion of them occur on private land and are out of sight, out of view, and out of the public consciousness. So just to give you a quick feel for the area, here's a picture showing you a cluster of meres in North Shropshire, which you can see the sort of agricultural setting and some recreational activity based on the lakes. And as you can imagine, there's quite a lot of pressure from nutrients and such like. And this slide shows one of the transition mires that I mentioned earlier, floating bog habitat or quaking bog. This is Chartley Moss National Nature Reserve, and you know, sites like this have extremely deep peat deposits. And another view, just to again sort of give you a feel of how the wetlands occur within the landscape. So you've got clusters of natural lakes indicated by the white arrows, and then the yellow arrows are indicating where there are peat deposits. And as you can see, a number of those peat deposits, for example, are woodland covered, showing that there's been quite extensive drainage, and they've been either naturally allowed to reforest or planted up. The foundation for partnership working in the Meres and Mosses was set down in the strategy for the conservation of the Meres and Mosses, which was produced by English Nature in 1998. And for the first time, it provided a strategic view of the whole area, and in terms of particularly with it focused on the 50 SSSIs which are notified across that landscape, and it contained a really thorough analysis which has stood the test of time of the issues and the problems and the solutions needed to tackle the conservation of these sites. For the first time, it set out a sort of vision for the area, which was in crude terms, protect the best and enhance the rest. For its time, it was quite forward-looking. And one of the key things it did identify was the need to start looking at the protection of our key wetland sites by looking at the catchments themselves. And from that, some partnership working was established with the Environment Agency and FWAG, the Farming Wildlife Advisory Group, looking at trying to target agri-environment schemes in the catchments of SSSIs. The strategy also recognised the need to not only look at the designated sites, but look at the non-designated sites for the first time. And I think it was very heavily influential in the future direction of the meres and mosses. In 2008, we were able to benefit from a grant from the National Wetland Vision Scheme, and for 3 years that provided us with funding for a series of actions, and it was a really key contribution really to the development of work in the meres and mosses, because the money allowed us to one, evaluate the resource across the landscape, so to look at the peatlands. I think we were able to look at 150 peatlands across the landscape and in a prioritised way evaluate them and identify which ones to focus on for conservation work. And secondly, there was some pump primer money made available to allow local projects to be taken forward, and a good example of that is the work that was started at Delamere Forest, which Delamere Forest is forest enterprises land where a lot of peatlands had been planted up and drained, and work started on trying to restore those. And I'm glad to say that has gone from strength to strength, and they've now pretty much restored all the peatlands within that forest estate. And only last month, the Cheshire Wildlife Trust were able to reintroduce beaver. So it was it set the pathway for that type of action. And then lastly, we were given the resource to invest in partnership development. There was a project officer appointed with a key output of developing a partnership and also producing an action plan. And so with the key partners of the RSPB, Wildlife Trust, Natural England, Environment Agency and local authorities, we were really able to set up for the first time a meaningful partnership. Building on from the Wetland Vision work, which happened between 2008 and 2011, put us in a good position to be able to put forward an effective bid to the Nature Improvement Area competition scheme that DEFRA launched in 2012. And because of the Wetland Vision sort of work that we'd been able to do, we were in a good position to be able to apply for that funding. And Shropshire Wildlife Trust led that initiative, and we're able to at the same time try and match the DEFRA money with a Heritage Lottery Landscape Partnership bid. Now that was successful, and in total there was the two funding pots provided an income of about £1.5 million. But one of the consequences of that was that the nature improvement areas had to be focused on smaller scale landscapes. So they were, I think the maximum area you could have was 40,000 hectares. So obviously that meant that a lot of focus of activity went into that area, and in the wider landscape there was a kind of reduction of focus. Those schemes because of the lottery input and the DEFRA scheme, DEFRA were more interested in the sort of nature outputs, whereas the Heritage Lottery were very much interested in the community outputs. So there was a kind of two-strand approach to that funding, which I think worked very well. And when that scheme was coming to an end in 2015, it was at the time when partners started to consider other funding opportunities out there, and the decision was made to try and apply for EU life funding. There'd been a long ambition to try and secure life funding. And obviously life funding is can only be directed towards special areas of conservation. So we took the decision to focus the bid around fens and wicks or mosses, which is third largest lowland raised bog in the UK. And I'm glad to say that the bid was successful, and the project was granted funding in 2016 for about £5 million, and the aim of that project is around the sort of restoration of that site. Although it's an SAC and it's one of our largest sites, it was severely degraded as a result of peat extraction, forestry and farmland impacts, and so there's a good deal of investment needed to bring that site into a better condition. So just to round up with where next for the Meres and Mosses as a partnership. As you've seen, as we've gone, we started out very wide at 400,000 hectare landscape, and we've ended up with a scheme that is just looking at 1,000 hectare project area. So I think one of the things we need to do is refresh our vision and revive the partnership and rethink how we go forward. The current the current environment is quickly changing with lots of new opportunities and a new context developing, and there's the obvious things around focus on carbon, DEFRA peatland scheme, new agri-environment schemes on the horizon, nature recovery network in development, and of course peatland code, etc. So all those things I think need to be thrown into a mix, and we need to have a rethink and refresh of how the partnership goes. I think a critical area for us is how do we get at the privately owned peatland sites, often tucked away in the landscape, and I think we need to be thinking about new approaches and maybe something like farmer-led approach to try and crack that. But I think critical to that is having the sort of tools and the policies from a national that support that, that support landowners wanting to change their land use, because it's a hard sell trying to get people to re-wet land when it's against their cultural values, and also it doesn't make sense economically. And then the last thing, I think, my last point is to say relationships are absolutely critical at all scales, and we need to keep investing at those between organisations, and particularly on the sort of landowner front, because that's where you get change ultimately.
Hello again, everyone. Thank you very much to the speakers this morning for those presentations. We have received some questions through the chat. I have also been drafting questions myself as we've been going, just to get the juices flowing. I will start off with one of mine, and then I'll go to the questions in the chat. Mark, this one I'll direct at you. One thing that we have found within the Peatland project is the role of a regulatory driver has been quite fundamental in facilitating at least the commencement of some of these ecosystem service markets. From your perspective and the work that you're doing, and I would potentially also put this over to you, Chris, as a follow-up, what role do you perceive the regulator as playing? Is it primarily in the priming position, or is it something that needs to be sustained throughout the system to ensure that there's appropriate levels of interest and investment in the supply chain?
Yeah, there are lots of different ways in which this this can potentially work. So a number of years ago, there was, I forget the name of it now, but it was a housing scheme that established a floor price for carbon and was going to recommend investment for, it was zero carbon homes, I think that's what it was called. And if you couldn't do that, you could offset, and they were going to recommend woodland carbon code or peatland code projects as the first port of call at, I think, a floor price of £60 per tonne. So that could have potentially driven quite a lot. We know that it's going to become mandatory in the next version of the planning framework for net biodiversity gain, and that's going to be driving habitat banking and the like, and there can be some overlap there with peatland projects. So yeah, you can create schemes like that that mandate things, and now a particular sector in those two examples, the house building sector, then has to do stuff. It's usually a series of options. There are different ways in which you can meet it, but you have to meet a requirement. The other approach is the kind of stuff that you were talking about there with well, the Environment Agency's Investment Readiness Fund, and the idea that government can pump prime projects that are not yet ready for investment, so that they've got something which is verifiable, that is monetizable. They've got something now that they can pitch to a funder. I think my concern is that if that's done in a kind of a disjointed way, that we might miss the bigger prize of actually creating these schemes with more integrated pipelines of projects. So, for example, the Blue Impact Fund, which is a marine fund, just launched. They're in their investment phase, but before reaching their investment phase, they got £90 million worth of projects ready to invest, and the whole pipeline designed and in place for that investment. And I think that investing in things like that, where it can give you a bigger bang for your buck in terms of that pump priming.
Thank you. Chris, did you have anything you wanted to comment on there?
Yeah, Liz, you use the word regulations and regulating, and government doesn't like doing that. You know, they don't like getting into a regulatory framework if they don't have to do so. But I think we are going to end up there at some stage, and for me, the sooner the better. The good thing about regulations is that it levels a playing field, and at the moment, very unlevel. I could make a deal, Robert there could make a deal, you could go out and make a deal, Liz, and those deals could be completely and utterly different. And we could also start to create precedents which would be unwelcome to others. So I think really UK government needs to, Scotland, Wales, England, just need to set the stall out properly, because if they don't, we will end up being by basically the brokers, and we'll end up with brokerage systems that are actually ruling us, which I think would be a bad move. We've almost ended up, well, not almost, but we were going down the road, and I think it's okay to say it was Interserve, because they're not doing that anymore. They were quite keen on creating a scheme with us, which when we got into it, we realised it was sounding very much like PFI for the environment, and that I don't think that would have been a good idea for us. But if we got into it, it might have been very difficult to get out of. And my concern is that some of us now start to jump into what appears to be good climate finance ideas, which end up being problems in the future and problems for others as well. We need regulations. We just need government to step up to the mark and actually put some regulations in place to level the playing field.
On that level of playing field, if I may just briefly, things like the Peatland Code standards like that are designed to create a level playing field, which is why we need more of them. Government, in my experience, has been reluctant to create them themselves or to own them. The Peatland Code is owned by the IUCN UK Peatlands programme, but government did fund the project that came up with the Peatland Code. And so I think there are two roles for government in particular. One is to fund the work necessary, and there's a lot of work necessary to create new codes that can level the playing fields beyond peatlands. And also then to give the right signals to the market. So Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code were very prominent in the 25-year plan and in many other strategies, processes. The England Peat Strategy, when it comes out, will no doubt reference the Peatland Code, etc. So having that messaging is also really important as well.
Thank you for that. And just to follow on from Chris's point, looking at you, Robert, in terms of the concern about private sector investment and the opportunities and challenges that represent, is that something that you're considering within your project?
It is something we would like to dip our toes into. I bet we're as you could probably see, we've taken a very conventional type of pathway of previous funding, and I think if we're going to be effective particularly in lowlands with small areas, we need to have a sort of a good model that we can roll out, and there needs to be support at the local level to enable that sort of bringing together all the different funding streams and then taking it to a landowner and taking them on that journey. And we haven't really embarked on that, although it's an ambition of ours.
Okay, thank you very much. Just before, I see people are ready to send us lots of questions now, which is great. So the juices have started flowing. So I'll try and pull out one here, which is directed at you, Robert, and it follows on from what you were just describing there. What's the approach that you're considering for this farmer-led? Is that, as you said, you're in the initial stages of thinking about it? Can you give us on that?
So we have got in parallel, really, independent of our own partnership, there's development of a sort of North Shropshire farmer-led facilitated group, and they're quite interested in having a conversation around peatlands that are in the landscape, and how they might be more taking the leadership, but being supported by partners, etc., in exploring the financial opportunities. I think how the economics work out in the lowlands, I think, is a lot more challenging in getting the package that's going to overcome the big issues that we face. You've got land prices, to me, are a big issue, because you start re-wetting land, and a lot of landowners will see that as dilapidation rather than improvement, and it's how you reconfigure that approach, I think, is a critical issue.
Thank you for that. Okay, as I said, there were lots of other questions coming in. So one thing that I will direct at you, Chris, it says that great presentations, thank you. This is from Liam McAleese. Chris noted that peat partnerships needed both capacity but also expertise to engage in rapidly increasing business financial interest. Could you start us off, Chris, with potentially saying more about what might be required, potentially more second careers for bankers, such as the Mark Carney example?
Thank you for that. Yeah. We've obviously missed employing Mark Carney ourselves, really, haven't we? I think we've missed that one. We're really, the issue is that we're all really short on capacity. We've got some very clever people that work with us that could lend their hand into the finance regime. But my argument would be that it's not our skill set. We're needed to do a much bigger important job, or as big important job. There are people who have expertise in finance, and we need to bring them on board. I can see that a special purpose body, a not-for-profit special purpose body working in peatlands, possibly a special purpose body in the uplands and special purpose body in the lowlands. You could imagine that they would work quite well. It may even be that what we need is we just need advice. We need somebody who is well capable of doing deals with the brokers. We're not, it's a new field for us. We've got to make mistakes if we're not careful. You know, we need an intermediary to do that for us. I think we're well capable of bringing blended finance to the table. So we're well capable of exciting government funds and other funds to come and play with us. It's the natural capital financing end of it. And as Mark has said already, we do have the Peatland Code, which is really useful. It gets us part way down that road. It doesn't get us down the bit of the road which is about playing hardball with banks, with insurance companies, with big companies, and that really is where we're missing some assistance, I think.
It's interesting, your suggestion of a special purpose vehicle, because I noted in your presentation you talked about the risks of us potentially making mistakes, because this is an area of expertise, but also somebody coming in who feels they have to extract a significant profit margin in order to participate in the system. So from your perspective, who would you see as best placed to host a special purpose vehicle like that? Would it be a statutory body like Natural England, Natural Resources Wales, Nature Scot, or should it be completely removed from public sector influence? And therefore, how would that potentially add a potential layer of administrative load on the system and therefore be accounted for?
I think small charitable trusts specifically set up to do that job would be one way of following that. My fear would be if Environment Agency, Natural England, government get hold of it, we have a habit of creating very big administrations for the purposes of having administration rather than because we need it. And I would be concerned that we may end up going down that road in creating ourselves an awful lot of validation and monitoring and administrative structures where really a lot of the body we will be working with now, so they're doing it for the look of it. They're doing it for PR benefits. You know, let's not kid ourselves, really. A lot of the people who would want to get involved in this are not necessarily ultimately dealing with their own carbon footprint. They're dealing with being able to say to the general guys, and our money should be put with them in terms of banks, insurance companies, and others. Means the same thing to us, but it's possibly less of a validation issue, and it's more of a negotiating issue that we need to get into. But that having custom-made special purpose bodies would be one way of doing it. The other way would be to have just very good advocates working for us who can do deals for us in very efficient ways.
Mark, has your research explored this possibility of that type of intermediary and how this could work alongside some of our charitable organizations that are delivering so much?
Not our research directly, but this is something that we've discussed as an executive board in the Peatland Code. As our Welsh colleagues explained, a lot of people find it overly complex, expensive. And as Chris said, people like Tim, people knocking on his door on a weekly basis saying, I want to put money to this. And I don't have an answer to this, but the caution that I have is that if we open the door to, well, we'll just do something, and you know what, the people who are paying don't really care about validation, all of this kind of stuff, well, the likes of Tim and Chris will deliver great projects, but then who's to stop other people turning up and delivering projects, taking money for things that actually don't deliver any benefits and potentially actually do more harm than good. And so that's one of the key reasons why we have a peatland code, is to ensure that there is a standard of projects, and you have to meet that standard in order to get accredited to that, and that maintains quality in the system. And I think the danger is that if we allow a lot of bilateral stuff to proliferate, that could then undermine the credibility of the overall market. So the answer has to be, where possible, simplifying, streamlining the peatland code, and we're looking at what we can do with version 2 of the peatland code, or considering if there is some other version of the peatland code or something that still enables that quality control, recognizing that not all investors need the same level of assurance as the peatland code in its full form gives. But quite how that's done, I'm not sure. There is a working group that is looking at that. I think that Tim's chairing, in fact. So yeah, work in progress, and I shouldn't take credit for that.
All right, well, this follows on quite nicely from that description. Obviously, the peatland code features large, but the comment was, what current organization in this space would the speakers point to as potentially having the greatest financial sophistication? So in the absence of a special purpose vehicle, is there one that you could point to, apart from the code, that would give you a good indicator as to the direction we should be traveling towards? I'll start with you, Mark, since that's a toughie.
So I'm involved with a group called the Broadway Initiative. They've just published a report, Financing UK Nature Recovery, and they have a number of organisations that work with them as part of this kind of consortium. Yeah, the Green Finance Institute in particular have a real breadth of expertise across different all three of those three types, because it's the market that I told you about. I was talking to someone from Finance Earth, who's part of Broadway Initiative this week, who's developing lowland peat projects, and saying, when can we do this through the peatland code? So as a consortium, they're very well connected. They've got a lot of expertise, but they can connect you through not only to the private sector, but they also have a lot of high-level government connections as well. So as a group, I say that covers pretty much everything. And if you had to choose one of those one of the organisations in that group, it would be Green Finance Institute. But of course, our very own Renee, although she's early in her post, ultimately is going to become the repository of knowledge on the peatland code. And when you put her together with the rest of the RUCN UK peatland team and our executive board and our technical advisory boards, there is a huge amount of expertise here in the UK, and others from overseas are looking at what we're doing in terms of peatlands, and asking how they can replicate that. So we are very lucky to have that. Excellent,
thanks. Chris, did you have anyone in mind when you would think of a model that you would like to ape?
Not in particular, no. I think I would go along with Mark's answer on that. Really, that there are the people who've designed the peatland code, the IUCN, the other academics that have been involved in that are onto that job. I was just making the point that we need to get there and do something, really.
Okay, thank you. And Robert, did you have anyone in mind that struck a chord for you when you were thinking of how you would like to take the project forward in the future?
I don't think I have at this point, actually, so I think I'll defer to Chris's and Mark's comments on that.
Okay, thanks very much.
I think there are, if I just make a point, I think there are those in the banking industry who ethical banking industry, so that have been around for quite a long time. So people like Triodos, Ecology Building Society, others who have got long lifespan of ethical finance. So we should really be taking note of their dealings and their advice, really.
And are you, as a project, doing that as well?
We're involved with Triodos. We've got links to Triodos, and we've also got links in with Esme Fairburn. They've got a question from Liam earlier on that. So Esme Fairburn, Triodos, some of our other charitable bodies have already done a lot of thinking, really. So there's some need to not reinvent wheels in this as well. We have to recognise that other people have dealt with ethical finance in a lot of other different ways, not just in natural capital, and we've got a lot to learn from other people who for years and years have been interested in ethical finance. So there's a lot of advice there we can learn from, really.
I agree. Okay, just to take a step back from that a bit, and a question directed to you, Robert, specifically about your project area. The question are the meres all natural, or are they derived from, say, mineral extraction in the past? Can you have potential buy-in from mineral companies as part of their biodiversity carbon requirements, or sold as cultural artifacts in the landscape? He's just trying to understand a bit more of the context of the system within which you're working. Yeah,
just a fairly quick answer is that the landscape there is of sort of glacial origins, and it's the hummocks and hollows left behind after the last ice sheet retreated that allowed these natural wetlands to develop. So they're all natural wetlands rather than artificially created ones.
Thank you. That's great. I have a couple more questions. I'll take a step back and ask if there's anyone on the panel who wanted to ask a question of anyone else on the panel before I presume that role, if anyone wants to wave their hand at me, if that's the case. Excellent. I'll go back to the list then. Marcus, question for you. Can you expand on where you see the segment of the market going that specifically relates to impact investors?
I'm not sure what more I can say on that in terms of. So I guess what I think we are. So yeah, here's something I can say. So I think what we're going to see an increase in the availability of green bonds or environmental impact bonds. There is going to be a government green bond that will be launched early next year. I'll put a link to some more information about that. But in terms of private sector bonds, there's a lot of experience in the US. I'm working with a US-led consortium that is trying to develop an environmental impact bond in the UK at the moment. I'm not allowed to say anything about it, sadly, but it is among a number of companies who are interested in that kind of model, and that is a model which is designed specifically to attract impact investors. So I think in answer to the question, I think that we're going to see an increase in the level of impact investing in nature-based solutions in the UK. But there are barriers to that at the moment. So it's being slow to take off. These bonds are being created, but they're not, generally speaking, live on the market yet. So more work is needed. But I think in 2021 we will begin to see these products emerging. Okay.
Thank you. Very interesting. And then following on from that, apologies, I'm redirecting this one at you as well, because it was specifically relation to the tools. They've asked, will your work on farm soil benefits be part of the work to look at how private funding will work with ELMS and the possible creation of credits?
Yeah, so I answered this in the chat, but
oh, did you? I'm sorry for that.
People didn't see that. So yeah, a number of us, I mean, those of us who are working on this are keeping in touch with DEFRA on this. And the ELMS team are fully aware of the fact that whatever they design will need to be at minimum compatible with the existence and proliferation of these private markets, but ideally that it will be synergistic with and leverage. And so a lot of talk within government circles, both north and south of the border. I mainly work in England and Scotland, about how government funding can leverage that private investment. And so that seems to be the kind of the current mantra at the moment. And so I think the first real test example of this is going to be the schemes that come out early next year under the DEFRA Nature for Climate Fund. So they've looked at the 5 options I gave in my talk and have been heavily adapting the idea of a carbon trigger fund. Who knows what will actually come out of that at the end of the day, but there is a stated aim to ensure that the schemes funded under that fund are not just compatible with, but ideally leverage private investment. So yeah, there's very much an awareness of that, but it's very much also work in progress, and it could well be that peatlands is where this is piloted for the first time.
Okay. Does anyone else want to make any comment there with relation to the use of these other tools within their projects? Okay, I've had a question come in, which is quite a good one to end on, because I'm sure we can all comment on it. And it's from Jenny Dad. And she says, what are the key things for projects to look out on in terms of greenwash that is a bit, well, stinky, potentially could do a great deal of harm? And if I'll just give a quick insight, the thing that we have done within the Peatland project, because a lot of our money has been public sector funding, it's given us that flexibility to, when a private sector investor has approached us, we effectively interrogate them thoroughly first as to their ambitions and objectives. And if they are not willing to work with us to help us develop the system that is the Peatland project approach, then we're more likely to step back. So we're not just interested in a cash transaction, we're interested in a philosophical transaction to us, and that's quite fundamental. And that often helps to ensure that we don't have any fly-by-nighters participate in a greenwashing scenario with us. Chris, can I point at you? Any response you would have to Jenny about that?
Yes, we are fortunate that we fall under the Peak District National Park Authority as our legal entity. So many of our structures also then come under them. The National Park Authority has a due diligence process, which means that if I would have to take things like that, contributions from people to the due diligence process to get clearance to accept it as an item of business on the National Park's books. What that does, it means that if I am if I am very keen and enthusiastic to accept a multi-million-pound deal with somebody who is still dunking seals in barrels of creosote or whatever, then my enthusiasm and glee at accepting money is then put through a process which wouldn't allow that to happen. I think basically we need to involve others in a diligence process, so we're not on our own completely answerable for the decisions that we take. It's good for us, it protects us as well, really, so that we can say, well, if we do get criticised, then we can then point at a process which has decided that is ethical and that is appropriate. I think it's difficult when we're really struggling for cash not to say yes to some things that other people with a clear head might say no to. So that's our get out of jail card on that one, really.
Thank you very much. And Robert, you've got a minute to answer that question if you guys have a similar process as well.
Yeah, I mean, we're very much in a different place, and what we have developed in our area is the Mears and Mosses business network, which occasionally we've been able to extract some funding from some members, but you know, generally we haven't, you know, that seems a very positive relationship, and we haven't had to have fears around the greenwash issue to date, but it's probably something to think about for the future for us.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you again to all the panelists for very interesting presentations and discussion today. And just as a nod to the next session in the agenda, that whole principle of governance and wider integrated systems thinking is an element we've exploring within the Pimliman project, and Jake Elster-Jones will be leading that workshop in the subsequent Zoom chat. So thank you very much for attending. I presume that our moderator will turn us off when we come to the end of our session. And thank you for a bunch of very interesting questions, and anything that's specifically directed to a project, I'll make sure gets sent their direction. Thank you.